France is brought to its knees by angry workers. Thousands walk off the job in protest at proposed labour reforms. Will yet more industrial action force the government to back down, or are unions losing their impact? Also on today's programme, an operation to stop human trafficking in Kosovo. Police say girls are being enslaved for sex. And in Picture This, back home after being abducted at gunpoint, Mexican footballer Alan Pulido is rescued by police. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. It's becoming an all too familiar sight in France. Rail workers are the latest to walk off the job in protest at proposed labour reforms, which would make it easier for firms to hire and fire. Oil refineries, power plants and transport services have all been disrupted recently by industrial action. And there's more to come this week from Paris Metro staff. Separately, Air France pilots have agreed a lengthy strike in June. Now, with just days to go until France hosts the Euro 2016 football tournament, the government is under intense pressure to reach some sort of agreements, although President Hollande says there's no turning back. Our newsmaker today is France, as we ask whether the strikes will work with the backing of their powerful unions.
For the protesters, it's a fight for French values and their rights, to protect the country's labour laws that they view as under attack. Weeks of strikes have disrupted much of the country. Many unions are opposed to government moves to support businesses by making it easier to hire and fire workers.
Je tiendrai bon parce que je pense que c'est une bonne réforme et que nous devons aller jusqu'à son adoption.
Quand il y a autant de contestations, quand il y a autant de rejets d'un projet de loi, il faut le retirer et recommencer à zéro pour rediscuter.
France has long had a reputation as a nation of strikers, and many analysts argue that over the years, that reputation has cost the country business and foreign investment. With tensions still high and the Euro 2016 football tournament due to kick off, will the government stick to the reforms at the risk of more social unrest? As the debate around France's labour laws has intensified, so too have the levels of anger and violence. The law would relax the rules around the country's 35-hour work week, make it easier to fire workers and weaken the power of the unions. The aim, the government says, is to make the labour market more flexible and get more people into work after a decade of near 10% unemployment. But in recent weeks, union workers have blocked oil refineries and nuclear power stations, leading to fuel shortages and long queues at the pumps. The government's had to dip into the country's strategic oil reserves to make up for the shortages. The CGT union is at the forefront of the protests. Rooted in France's Communist Party, it says the labour changes will harm employees' rights. And more strikes are planned this week and in June. One poll suggests almost two-thirds of the public back the protests. As for François Hollande, the strikes couldn't have come at a worse time. His approval ratings are already the worst of any post-war French leader, and his hopes for re-election in 2017 are taking another blow.
Elle va passer.
Vous ne céderez pas.
Pourquoi ? Parce qu'elle a été discutée, elle a été concertée, elle a été corrigée, elle a été amendée.
As France prepares to host Euro 2016, it could face a summer of discontent. The unions are betting the government will back down to avoid embarrassment, but the government's banking on public opinion turning against the protesters. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Paris to discuss whether France's trade unions are right to strike is Didier Hotte. He's a spokesman for Force Ouvriere, one of the unions backing the walkouts. And in London is Diego Zuluaga. He's a financial services research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Let me start with you, Didier. You have railways, nuclear power stations, oil refineries, people walking off the job there, trouble in the streets. This is not good for the economy. Is it worth it, in your opinion?
Well, in our opinion, it's worth it. And moreover, a recent poll has established that more than 70% of the population think the El Khomri bill is not a good thing. So I think, in fact, we must compare what we have and what will be at risk if that law is implemented. In fact, today, everything can be discussed at the national level. What the bosses and what the law is going to implement, if it goes through, is that the bargaining will be bring back to the local level. Yeah. And of course, the balance will not be in favor everywhere of the workers. So this we don't want, because it has always been a tradition and the law that everything was bargained and discussed at the national level.
Okay.
Moreover,
okay, sorry, let me just interrupt you for just 1 second, because you called it the El Khomri law. It's after legislator Miriam El Khomri. Just for clarity, this is the labor law. You said that more than 70% of French actually want it withdrawn. Now, at the end of March, it was over 70%. However, today, recent polls show that only 45% of French want it withdrawn. It's because of the trouble in the streets, right? They're seeing cops, cars being torched, and they're going, hey, maybe this is pushing it too far. Maybe we're not so sure about this, Didier.
First of all, I would like to point out that it's not a civil war in France. Of course, there have been a bunch of hooligans who have attacked the police forces. At the same time, they have attacked the security services of the union. So they are uncontrolled band of hooligans, and they have nothing to do with us. In fact, what is in the most important things to see, it's why are we in such a situation? I want to point out that the government did not respect the French law. Why? Because in the French law, in 2007, has been implemented a law that stated that on any social issue, there should be first a bargaining with the employer's representative, with the worker's representative, and the government has neglected this obligation.
Okay.
We have
so there's another person in this debate, and that's a point well made.
In the press.
Okay, sure. There's another person in this debate. Let me put that to him first. Before we talk about the economics, Diego, the government invoked Article 49.3. This didn't go to a vote. They just pushed it through the National Assembly without a single vote. So before we talk about the economics, Diego, could they have done this in a better way and actually put it to a vote without just pushing this thing through and expecting everybody else to accept it?
Well, I think they could have, but they might have failed because the Socialist Party is split on this question between reformers and the more old left contingent. And the old left contingent is
So then that's not democracy, right? That wouldn't be what the people wanted then.
Well, no, it is constitutional. The French constitution gives a lot of powers to the president, and it's very executive-driven, and that's precisely what's happening in this case. You have the president driving most of the course of events and bypassing parliament in a bid to provide constitutional and legal stability in a context of political instability. I think you can question whether it is the best constitution to have and whether other European countries have better systems for addressing these things, but there is no doubt that in the French context, it is perfectly legal and legitimate to act in this way through Article 49.
Okay, then let's talk money and society and effects on the workers. It's easier to get fired, your working hours are up, your retirement age is up. How is that good for a worker, Diego? Workers are naturally going to revolt against that.
Well, some workers will, because they have been protected by the existing system. But the sad thing about France is that it's had a very complex, very rigid, and very prescriptive labor code for many, many years. And that's prevented some people from actively joining the labor market and improving their conditions. And one of the ways in which you can tell that is in the structural unemployment rate. And what I mean by that is that France has had about 10% unemployment almost continuously since 1980, whether in very good economic times, in times of crisis, crisis, you have very little fluctuation in the unemployment rate. And that's a clear signal that the labor market isn't flexible enough to either adapt to increasing demand or to a reduction in supply. And that has consequences for economic growth and for the overall dynamism of the economy. And that's really the context in which we must look at this piece of legislation.
Okay, let's get a response to that.
An attempt to try and make...
Okay, let's get a response. So Didier, the labor market's not flexible enough. The current situation makes it very difficult to hire and fire. There'll be less red tape. You can hire more people with the labor reforms. It's good for the economy. Didier?
Yeah. I know that, but I don't share this opinion because, in fact, there is already a lot of flexibility in the labor market because most of the new jobs are hired under short-term contracts. It's not zero-hour contracts like in Great Britain.
Well, precisely,
but short-term
because hiring on a long-term contract is too expensive.
So, in fact, there is a lot of flexibility already. And I don't think if you increase that flexibility, it will make good for the economy because you will have lower rates, lower pay, lower situation for the workers, and of course they will not buy as much as they could have done with a better pay. When you want to rent a house and when you want to buy a house, what ask the bankers? They ask, what is your job? If you say I have short-term contracts, you can have a loan, you can have a good flat or good apartment. So obviously it's against the economic, it's against the situation of the workers, and it's against the population in general.
Okay. So Diego, there's very little collateral. You can't really hedge it against assets or a stable job. It makes life more difficult for you on short-term contracts. Diego?
No, the problem in France is that we have a two-tier labor market. We have a group of insiders, people who are heavily protected, and that may well benefit them, but it comes directly at the expense of a group of workers, often the most underprivileged, who are not able to access the labor market in a proper way. And it is intimately related to minority groups and people who are stuck in certain parts of town where they are not able to reach economic opportunities. Those are the same people that are sidelined by current labor market regulations. As to the fact that it's related to economic prosperity, well, I would doubt it. If you look around Europe, the countries that have flexible labor markets, Nordic countries, including Denmark or the UK, they have thriving employment and very high rates of occupation and very low rates of unemployment, whereas the countries that have rigid labor laws
but could you
the
say,
sort that France is trying to reform right now, such as Spain and Italy and so on, they tend to
finish his point.
high
Didier,
unemployment
let him finish
and very low rates of
his
employment.
The rate of poverty in those countries, and in fact the workers, poor workers are increasing in those countries where flexibility is reigning. And in fact, in France, of course, nearly 90% of the workers are protected
much
by
higher rates of growth,
national convention,
much higher rates of
or
employment,
status.
and in general are much better off. And they're much better at making the poor improve their condition. The trouble in France, the trouble in France is that you have no social mobility right now.
They are not healthier. And in fact, I think you are confusing the rate of employment and the rate of poverty. And the rate of poverty is increasing, in fact. So I think that, for instance, in Belgium, actually there are strikes too.
Can I just put a pause on this just for a second?
Caused by the
can I just put a pause on this just for a second?
The thing that's happening...
Don't come in. Didier, I don't want to get bogged down into this. I want to look at where we can go from here on in right now. Prime Minister Manuel Valls, Didier, has said that it can be modified. They will look at it. Will you negotiate? I mean, this is how societies are built, right? Somebody proposes something, there's pushback, and then you negotiate. Will you negotiate?
Well, of course, we are ready to negotiate. But there is a previous condition that the Article 2 of the labor law be smashed before. Because, in fact, it's the main issue in that law. And if the government accepts to say, OK, we have made a mistake, we are going to discuss again, well, we could go to the negotiation. It's not only from Force Ouvriere talking. The CGT has said nearly the same thing. But Mr. Valls and Mr. Hollande don't want to go to move back for political reason, not for economical reason, for political reason. And for that, they are simply making the situation more and more difficult every day. Because
Didier, is this particularly
kind of a contest?
Yes. So is this particularly sore for you and the unions in general because this is a socialist government? Do you feel betrayed by the socialist government?
The answer is yes. Yes, of course we have been betrayed. Because in that campaign in 2012, President Hollande never said, I'm going to increase flexibility. He said, my enemy is the finance. That's what he said. Okay, we didn't ask him to say that, but in fact he said it. And today, in the last year of his mandate, he's trying to implement one of the worst laws that have ever been conceived against the workers. So obviously there had to be a problem.
Diego, a betrayal of their mandate or just being pragmatic politicians in office?
It's basically just responding to the laws of economic gravity. And it's very similar to the last socialist government. If you remember, in the 80s, Mitterrand came into power with a very left-wing interventionist agenda. But very quickly, it transpired that it just wasn't feasible and that it was measurably hurting the economy. And Hollande came in also with a very interventionist high-tax agenda. If you remember correctly, he tried to introduce a 75% extra tax rate for the wealthiest people. But the consequences were dreadful, and you had thousands and thousands of French people leaving the country and moving to places including the UK because economic conditions had worsened so badly in France. So really what we see is a turnaround to acknowledge that you need more flexibility in labour markets and you need a more dynamic economy in order to have a sustainable recovery.
Diego,
France, what it hasn't been having is sustainable rates of growth.
Yeah,
That's what
we're
it
seeing
needs.
across the border, sorry to interrupt you, we're seeing across the border in Belgium that rail workers are striking over cuts to their time off. Is this what you money men would call contagion? Is it because of France that things are kicking off in Belgium?
I don't think so.
Well,
I think these things tend to be very national,
Oh.
and the fact that we are having strikes in Belgium is probably related to the economic situation in Belgium itself, which also has very onerous labor laws and very heavy social security mandates on both employers and employees. What you really are seeing is that in the countries of Europe that have very rigid labor laws, increasingly it's an unsustainable situation.
Okay.
And from both sides, you're getting pressure to try and reform them.
Okay, my final question for Didier. You don't want to see the Euros disrupted, do you? It's a showcase event. It'll be a fantastic football tournament. You want this sorted out before the Euros, don't you, Didier?
I hope so, but we are calling for a national protest march in June the 14th, and we hope that the Senate and the debate that will happen in the government will allow those points to be sorted out before the beginning of the Euro. But if the situation doesn't improve, we cannot warrant that it will not impact the Euro competition.
Okay, gentlemen, that was absorbing and passionate. Thank you very much for joining us, Didier and Diego. Still to come in the Newsmakers, the girls in Kosovo being enslaved for sex. And in Picture This, how an international footballer fought off his captors in Mexico. Police in Kosovo say they're seeing a worrying trend in human trafficking. Victims are getting younger. The small Balkan nation is trying to stop enslavement of women and girls, mostly for sex. From the capital Pristina, Soraya Lennie reports.
This is what it looks like to fight human trafficking. A team of 55 detectives and police who operate in the darkest corners of society. They're trying to rescue women trafficked for sex and arrest those forcing them into it. Police say the victims are getting younger.
Children are much easier to be manipulated by traffickers. In most of these cases, these children are being used sexually. They are from families that have problems. They don't go to school, or they're from situations without family values.
Human trafficking flourished in Kosovo in the late 1990s as ethnic Albanians fought the former Yugoslavia for independence. NATO sent in 50,000 soldiers from 39 nations.
Just after the war, we had the UN mission here and many more foreign organizations. They brought many good things, but also bad. Now we have internal trafficking, and it's flourishing.
This burnt-out place doesn't look like much now, but it was then a hub for traffickers. The women who worked here were mainly from Eastern Europe, trafficked to work as prostitutes after the war in 1999. And this used to be the bar their clients sat at. And there were many places like this one. But police say since that time, the nature of human trafficking has changed. Now trafficking has moved underground and the victims are mostly local. The criminals are often working alone instead of in big organisations. We're going to meet a woman who's a victim of human trafficking. She's also a protected witness in an ongoing court case, and that's why we can't reveal her identity nor show the location where we're meeting. She asked us to call her Lena. It's not her real name. She tells us just how quickly and easily she became a victim. She had a fight with her family, left home, and went to stay with a friend temporarily. But instead of helping her, he raped her and forced her into prostitution.
He was like an animal, violent. His fiancée was there too. When he would leave the house, he would lock us in. I was so scared for my life. I didn't call the police. I realized it was a huge mistake.
It was actually a customer who helped Lena escape.
I had heard of trafficking, but I never thought it would happen to me. I never understood those women and how they find themselves in that situation.
Police say that's part of the problem. Many people in Kosovo think the women are willing participants, when in most cases, they're actually enslaved. Soraya Lennie, The Newsmakers, Pristina.
And Soraya's back in Istanbul now, and she joins us now for a chat. Soraya, powerful piece of journalism. A lot of people watch this sort of stuff and go, wow. But then they have questions about scale. They wonder just how extensive is the problem?
Well, according to the police, it's more extensive than the figures suggest, and it's more extensive than they know. And one of the reasons, as I mentioned, is because it's so underground. Last year, the police carried out around 160 investigations into trafficking. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a very young nation, only 1.8 million people. And they really rely on people from the community basically coming forward and saying, we think that there's something wrong. They also say there's a problem in the courts in that once the police do the investigations, prosecutors will only prosecute maybe a third of those cases, and then the penalties being dished out are quite low. So there is a reluctance, of course, for victims therefore to come forward. If they think that there's not going to be a proper punishment, they're putting themselves and their families at great risk, basically, of revealing what's been going on.
There was a lot of great hope for Kosovo, one of the newest nations on earth. For people watching this and asking, why Kosovo? Why especially Kosovo? What would you say?
Well, according to the data, it comes down to a couple of things, and one of them is geography. Kosovo is smack bang in the middle of the Balkans. It's also a former major trafficking route, not just in terms of human trafficking, but in the movement of illegal goods from, for example, Africa across the Mediterranean, also from the Middle East in terms of weapons, even human organs. There have been a lot of documented cases through the United Nations about this happening in the Balkans. Now, Kosovo's gone a long way in terms of cracking down on this, because now they've initiated visa reform in which it's effectively not an open place anyone can travel to. You need a visa to go there.
Okay, Soraya, good to get further insight into your piece. Good journalism there.
Thank you.
In today's Picture This, a professional football player who was kidnapped in Mexico has been rescued by the authorities. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been France, as we asked whether labour unions can win their battle and force the government to withdraw its controversial labour law reform. Despite strikes and protests, French President François Hollande said that he will not back down. But with just days to go until France hosts Euro 2016, the government is under increasing pressure to reach an agreement. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.